Good evening, and thank you for joining the Westerly Library in Wilcox Park for tonight's author talk. This program is being presented using the webinar version of Zoom, and attendees are joining in listening mode only. Please send any and all questions through the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and we will do our best to answer all questions within the time we've allotted. Please note that this talk is being recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel. Should you get disconnected, simply use the link that was emailed to you earlier to get back into the program. I will now turn it over to President of the Board of the Friends, Peg Murphy-Bright.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome. As Amanda said, I'm Peg Murphy-Bright, and as President of the Friends of the Westerly Library in Wilcox Park, I thank you for attending this evening's program. It's a wonderful evening, a talk with Francis J. Bing West, author of The Last Platoon, a novel of the Afghanistan War, which chronicles how Marines fight bravely and die needlessly in the searing story of America's longest war. This virtual talk is being presented in partnership with the Westerly Library. Thank you, Amanda Wagner, for coordinating the logistics. And the Friends of the Westerly Library. Thank you, Mary Weiss, for suggesting we contact Mr. West. And thank you, Major Murphy-Bright, for reaching out to Mr. West. Most of all, thank you, Bing, for agreeing to this talk. We are very excited and extremely privileged to have you with us tonight to discuss your compelling latest book about our war in Afghanistan. The Los Angeles Times has dubbed Mr. West as the Grunt's Homer. He is the author of 11 books about our wars in Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. During his illustrious career, he is credited with writing The Village, about the daily lives of 15 Marines who protected Vietnamese villagers by living among them in their hamlets. This tome became a classic of practical counterinsurgency, and for over 5 decades has remained on the Marine Corps' Commandant's required reading list. He has co-authored with General Jim Mattis the #1 New York Times bestseller, Call Sign KS. Mr. West is a Marine combat veteran who served as a Marine grunt in Vietnam and later as an Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security in the Reagan administration. He has worked for the RAND Corporation, a nonprofit institution that helps improve policy and decision-making through research. He is a nationally acclaimed war correspondent and has embedded with our troops numerous times. Bing knows Marines, and he has been on hundreds of patrols in Iraq and Afghanistan, including many operations with General Mattis. Mr. West was twice awarded the Pentagon's top medal for distinguished public service. He is a member of the Military History Working Group at the Hoover Institution. Bing has 4 grown children and numerous grandchildren. He lives with his wife, Betsy, in Hilton Head, South Carolina, and Newport, Rhode Island. Before I turn the podium over, I want to introduce you to Major Murphy-Bright, coincidentally my son, United States Marine Corps reservist, who will be our moderator for this evening's talk. Major Bright has served in both the active Marine Corps and the Marine Corps Reserves and is deployed to hotspots around the world, and most recently in 2019, he returned from an arduous deployment in Afghanistan. Murphy and Bing have a shared experience. As a newly minted second lieutenant, fresh out of IOC, which is Infantry Officer Course, in 2011, Murphy headed to Camp Pendleton in California. He was attached to the 3rd Battalion's 5th Marine, known as 3-5 or the Dark Horse. He was assigned as a platoon leader for Kilo Company. In his first week on the job, he was tasked with the somber duty of witnessing a memorial service for 25 of his fellow Marines who did not make it home from a deployment in Sangin, Afghanistan. The 3-5 sustained the highest casualty rate of any Marine unit during the Afghan War, losing 25 men. Ironically, this was the same unit that Bing had embedded with for over the 7 months deployment. Bing wrote eloquently about this experience in his book, 1 Million Steps, which honors these brave men. I suggest you read that book. And we have a special guest here tonight, Vic Garcia, who actually was the platoon commandant in that particular deployment and who was honored in Bing's book. Bing and Murphy and Vic and all of you else in the service, we thank you both for your service. And I will now turn the evening over to Murphy and Bing.
Thank you. Platoon commander, not commandant, but
I meant commander. Forgive me. I'm just a mother.
Thank you again, sir, for your remarkable service and for agreeing to be with us this evening. Before we dive into the Q&A, I thought we could spend a few minutes so we can orient our guests to the terrain of Helmand to set the scene for our conversation. I know Amanda is going to pull up some pictures and we will go through them.
Let's start with the title of the book. Thank you. Thanks, Murph. Thank you, Peg. So this is my novel that is my effort to write a metaphor of the war for 20 years, how it was fought and why we really couldn't win it. And could I have the next slide, please, Amanda? With us, we have this handsome fellow, otherwise known as Vic Garcia. Vic was, I took this picture when we were after a day of combat back in probably 2012 or so. You can see Vic on the right. He's changed a lot now. His hair is about 1/4 of an inch shorter, but Vic is now a major. And I did ask Vic's permission to tell people that he really is, and he gave it to me after discussing it with his wife, that he is the prototype platoon commander whom I called Cruz in the novel, but it's based upon Vic. And this, may I have the next slide, Amanda? This is part of his platoon. May I have the next slide, please? And also embedded at the same time in the movie, in the book, I have the CIA, and the CIA sometimes were permitted to wear beards where the rest of the Marines were not. So we have some CIA agents in the novel along with the platoon. Next slide, please. This is the terrain. This is the river that is explained in the novel, and the Marines had a fire base to the left side of the river, and all the action takes place in an area about this size. Now notice how green it is. And it's called the green zone because the river, the Helmand River, comes all the way down from the Hindu Kush, 400 miles to the north, and brings with it nutrients as well as water, and makes this very, very lush. But when you're out fighting in it, it's really, really tough. And you have a lot of close encounters of the third kind in that kind of terrain. Next slide, please. This is how it looks when you're out with Vic. I took this picture when I was out with Vic Garcia one day. Vic is toward the front of the column, but this is what it looks like when you spread out and you're walking through this particular area, and every single step, you don't know where the next improvised explosive device or next mine is going to be. I wrote the novel in order to illustrate how hard it is. When I was with Vic, Vic started with 52 Marines, but he ended up with 26. He had about 9 gunshots wounds and about 17 IED explosives, 9 amputations. So he started with 26. He started with 52, ended up with 26. Next slide, please. We also had with us, and in the novel I have the Afghans, and this is how the Afghans look when they're walking across. They pretty much tried to copy everything we did. Next slide, please. And this is typical. I think this is Mac, Vic, but this is typical of what happens when you're going along and somebody shoots at you. A Marine will stand up, and you notice on his rifle, there's a telescopic sight. And he's using the telescopic sight to try to see where did that shot come from. And this would happen 5-10 times a day. Next slide, please. Then you really had to be buckled down when you saw this. The Taliban battle flag is white. And they were out there to fight. And so when you were out on those patrols, when you saw that white flag, you began to know you're in Indian territory, you're in the Comanche territory, they're out there to kill you, and pretty soon you're going to be in a firefight. Next slide, please. When you would talk, this is typical of a farmer, you'd talk to any of the farmers, and of course, they'd say, no, I've never seen any Taliban. I don't know what you're talking about. But would you please get out of here because I'm trying to collect my poppy and you're interfering with that. Next slide, please. This is where it really got interesting. When you saw, this is a typical Afghan adobe hut, But notice the Taliban flag. And when you get near something like this, as Vic said, and the first time I saw this, he said, "Hey, Bing, we're not going anywhere near there," because they would put mines around the house, believing that you would come and try to capture their flag and blow yourself up. Next slide, please. Okay, so the novel is all about war and what was happening, and every single day. And this is, bluntly, this is how Vic's platoon kept score. Every one of these hatched figures is a dead Taliban. May I have the next slide, please? And this is, I should blot out the facial features, but this is one of the dead on the other side. And you can see that they have thick beards, and around their foreheads, they will generally have Islamic prayers when they go into battle. May I have the next slide, please? And so you end up with a platoon, and the book is called The Last Platoon, because I set this platoon on the last mission. And then I try in the novel to explain what happened. So that gives you context, and I'll turn it over to Murph. Murph?
Perfect. Thanks so much, Bing. And I think this is pretty good then to transition to our first question. So not everyone in the audience is versed in military jargon and structure. Can you give us a brief breakdown of what constitutes a Marine battalion? Also, what it means to be outside the wire, what is the green zone, and what are the rules of engagement?
Well, let's skip the battalion, because in the novel, I simply take one platoon. That's roughly 40 Marines. They're sent over there only for 1 week, very short mission. They're simply to provide a little bit of artillery support and then get the heck out. And I have the president in the book saying, you got to keep this short. And when they're there, the issue then becomes, once you set in and you put up your barbed wire and you have that kind of terrain all around you, who's protecting you? And that's the expression, outside the wire. You can't stay buttoned up. So I have the president saying, well, they can't get into trouble. They have barbed wire. Holy smokes, you don't let anyone walk up to your barbed wire. So you have to send people like Vic out, and Vic is the lieutenant, the platoon commander, but he has to go deeper and deeper to keep the Taliban away from the little base, because the Taliban don't want us interfering with their drug running. And so outside the wire means you have to leave. Then everyone's on an equal footing. Oh yeah, we have wonderful technology, but in terrain like that, everyone's equal out there, and they're out there to kill you, and you're out there to kill them. But they haven't come out there to commit suicide. They believe they can succeed. And that's what I try to do in the novel, is show that this was two-sided every single day. It was never one-sided.
Perfect. And then, so with that, your chapter titles really draw us in. For example, Counterpunch, Ambition Dash, No Right Decision, The Tipping Point, and Control the Narrative. How do these titles play into the narrative of politics versus reality?
What I tried to do was write the story from 4 points of view that two of whom I know very well. I tried to write it from the White House, Pentagon, 4-star general point of view. And I've known those youngsters forever. I can say they're youngsters now because some of them are younger than I am, but I've known them for a long time. And I'm trying to indicate that their view of what Vic Garcia was doing was crazy. I mean, it didn't really compute to what was really happening. Then I try to show what Vic Cruz was doing on the ground. Now, the interesting thing that what Vic had to do, Cruz, is 2 things. He had to persuade his platoon to risk their lives as they began to lose people. That's tough to do. And not everyone was in favor of him. And then he had a commander in charge of him, a colonel out there, who was ambitious and couldn't understand what Garcia was doing, but didn't want casualties. So he's trying to deal with that. Then I tried to bring in the point of view of the Taliban. Why did they care that we were there? Well, it was simple. First, it was their turf. And second, about one half of Afghanistan's entire economy is poppy. And you collect the poppy seed at a time, then you crush it and you make opium. Then you add some chemicals to it and you have heroin. Now a farmer is being paid $15,000 a year, which would be equivalent to about $75,000, $100,000 a year over here, to make heroin. And the Taliban are getting 15 to 20%. So you have the villagers, the farmers saying, we don't want Vic Garcia, we don't want Cruz here. And you have the Taliban saying, we're going to get rid of him. And then the fourth aspect that I try to bring in, look, the Taliban were always going to win this war because they had a sanctuary called Pakistan. Now, I'm perfectly willing later to get into why did presidents of the United States ever cause us to get into that situation, but they did. So I try to bring it back to Pakistan because Pakistan was making a lot of money. And so I try to indicate you put this combustible group together on a battlefield and all hell breaks loose.
The Last Patrol has been described as a story of illusion versus reality, courage versus fear, and duty versus ambition. Can you elaborate on that?
The illusion was that Washington was in a dreamland. That's the only way I can put it. But they remained there for almost 20 years. And our four-star generals did a terrible job of not acknowledging that you couldn't build a nation in Afghanistan. So that was the illusion. The leadership, and this book is all about leadership. It's all about Cruz. It's all about Garcia on the one hand, trying to do his best for a mission that he knows isn't going to work, versus his colonel who can't understand why they're losing people, but knows it's going to hurt him for making general. And it's a clash of leadership styles on a battlefield. And it's a little bit like some of your listeners may have read the Caine Mutiny. Now, Captain Queeg was in charge of that ship, and he shouldn't have been. But in the end, after the mutiny is over, one of the protagonists said, you know, maybe we didn't do right by him, because while he was wacko in certain ways, in the chain of command, he was the captain. So I don't, at the end of the novel, have a neat way in which Captain Cruz becomes the hero and the colonel becomes the enemy, becomes the devil. It's leadership is much more complicated. And I try to go into, we're all selfish to a certain extent, and then we try to overcome it. And the one thing I have to say about Cruz and I have to say about Garcia, at one point after we had lost some people when I was out with Vic Garcia, I said, what do you tell them? Because the Marines aren't stupid. They knew we weren't going to win the war. And Vic said, I tell them, you volunteered to be here, so you always do your best. Do your best. You don't control other things. You do control how you act.
This next question is kind of similar to the themes, but I think it's even more important since we have Vic with us tonight. So there are many themes that we want to cover this evening, but first, in writing The Last Platoon, your opening chapter alludes to the events that occurred in Sangin and introduces us to Diego Cruz, our protagonist. Can you discuss the impact of the real life experience had in the writing of The Last Platoon?
No, I certainly am not. I'm going to ask Vic Garcia to answer that question. Vic?
Restate the question, Murphy, please.
No problem, brother. Just if you could go over kind of your real life experiences from being on that deployment, and kind of how they came out in the book.
I think Bing does a really awesome job of telling the story of both the original Platoon in a million steps, and then ties that into his novel. I think he does an outstanding job of describing the individual and the reasons why Marines are doing what we do.
But Vic, could you elaborate just a little bit? How did you keep them going out into that combat when they knew every day some of them were going to die, and they knew they weren't going to win?
I think that is a difficult leadership challenge. However, ultimately, Marines want a challenge. Marines want to matter, and Marines want to do whatever mission they're given. So despite being a difficult mission, despite being scared, you have to give them little challenges and make them win little things to build their confidence to go out and tackle the large things, and to get that mentality of you can't stop me, to get the mentality that we cannot be defeated. Even though you're taking casualties, you're going back out, you're putting your gear on, and you're stepping out. And I think part of that is also leadership by example. So I'd go out every day, sometimes twice a day, no matter what. So it wasn't sending them out. I was going out with them, sharing the sacrifice and the risk.
In the novel, I try to indicate how different the squad leaders were, and you know who they were. Can you just have a little fun and tell us how you had to work with one squad leader to get him to do something, and how you had to rein somebody else in? You see what I mean? That you had to know those squad leaders individually and what they would and wouldn't do.
Yes, Bing. I think knowing your men, I took the platoon over, if you read the first book, obviously, after Lieutenant Cam West was injured. So it was not my platoon. So I didn't have the time to build the platoon. I came in and took over what he had. And that's a difficult situation when you're trying to motivate guys who just lived through their lieutenant being ripped apart by an IED, and one of their best friends, Bulk, being killed by that same IED, and numerous other people being injured. So walking into that and going the next day, walking into the platoon and giving them their task, giving them their mission, and trying to feel them out, you get to know which squad leaders are going to do the things that you're asking, and which squad leaders are going to kind of give you the runaround every time you give them a mission and they don't accomplish it. So with one particular squad leaders, I was sending him to different parts of the map on purpose to see a specific, very detailed mission. Go to this house, tell me how many people are in this building, instead of your usual, I'm just going to check the mission and say it's good. Vice other squad leaders, Mad Dog or Mac, I would have to rein him in because he was just a wild man and have to pull back on his chain. And kind of, in retrospect, a couple of times I did not set myself up for success by allowing him to be in the front.
Back to you, Murph.
Thanks for that, Vic. Vic had no idea he was going to be put on the spot, so I owe you a couple beers. Two, yeah. What was your motivation in having Cruz overlooked for what appeared to be a much-deserved promotion to major? Is it all politically motivated, and can you describe the disparity in leadership styles and motivation as evidenced by Colonel Coffin and Captain Cruz and their relationship with their troops? Where does the trust come in?
Wow. I think that's the essence of the whole book, that I tried to set Cruz up by having been passed over for promotion because he wasn't good at admin and the Marines weren't going to war anymore. And now he's out there, but he knows his job. But the colonel resents that he's there to begin with, because he was sent out there by his old friend, the general, to try to give him another command so he could be promoted. And the colonel has his way of doing things, And Cruz knows that the colonel is wrong. And so you set up this dynamic that goes through the entire book. And I'm sure that we don't want to put Vic too much on the spot, or you, Murph, but we both, I mean, anyone listening knows that not every boss is a good boss. And occasionally you run into a real pain in the ass. And in this particular case, if you're in a rigid organization like the Marines, the question is, how do you do your best, motivate your people, and get along with this colonel who, on the other hand, the colonel is the one dealing with Washington. So I try to make it as realistic as possible. And also I try to indicate what the generals and the president were doing and how clueless in a lot of ways they were about what was really going on. So I took everything that I had learned over 20 years out there and tried to put it into one novel.
And that leads into the next question. So can you elaborate then more on the chain of command and what an ideal situation would be when you are the boots on the ground commander, and particularly about Kaufman's constantly running back to Killian, who's stateside and always looking for advice?
Well, I have to tell you, two different things. First, throughout the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, we had all the way down, with the exception of Vic's platoon, but in the novel, I changed that. Vic was lucky. Vic did not have internet. But when he was out there with his platoon, he was just out there. But in the novel, I kept the perfect communications that we have. So that here's Vic, here's Cruz on the ground and his colonel, and they can talk all the way back to the president. That's how good the communications is today. So you have a tendency at the top to, trying to drill down because you can talk and you think, therefore, you know something. That exists today everywhere. Every ambassador can immediately be called up by the president. Any four-star can be. And it drives other people in the chain of command crazy, because you can have a Zoom call and you can have 10 different people all the way up to the president and all the way down to the Colonel Kaufman. Now, let me suggest something to everybody listening. I think that we're going down the wrong path. The way we're now talking, I believe two things. First, there's going to be another war, because there's always another war. There's always another hurricane. That's human nature. But in the next war, you're not going to have that kind of communications. And I think our military has gotten a little bit too used to this. On the one hand, mother may I have to ask up the chain of command. And on the other hand, the people at the top thinking they can reach down, that's going to be gone. The communications are going to be cut off. So what I have in the book may not be what actually happens in the next war.
Your novel has been described as, on the surface, a war story spanning 1 week with Marines in the end phase of Afghanistan. Between the lines is the soul-sucking realization that the past 20 years in the country add up to absolutely nothing. It's Vietnam all over again. Win the battles, lose the war. Can you elaborate on what is meant by that?
Unfortunately, whoever wrote that was pretty accurate about what I was trying to do with the book. I wrote the book to a certain extent because I was pretty angry that here I am, an old guy who through luck has been through 3 wars and also has been to the White House many times and different jobs. And for many, many years, I couldn't understand what the top was doing. Trying to say we're going to build a nation in Afghanistan struck me as being crazy. Those tribes are hurtling headlong into the 9th century. And therefore, I wanted somebody reading this novel to be interested in how is it going to come out? Who's going to win here? But at the same time, as they're reading it, to be saying, how do the people at the top ever think we could win this? And that's why I kept bringing it back to the president, to show at the top how people at the top think, whether they're Democrat or Republican, they think differently. And I can tell you, because I've been there enough myself, I don't care who you are. When you go into the White House, You're going into the halls of power of the world. And when you walk down the corridors that are very small, it's very small. The ceiling is right there. The walls are right here. And there are Ansel Adams and other fantastic paintings and camera work on the walls. The history is redolent. And you walk into that Oval Office, and all of a sudden, I don't care who you are, you become very careful what you have to say. And as a result, there are many filters. And so I try to illustrate in the book, even when all this violence was going on, what was coming through at the top it wasn't making real sense, but nobody really dared say the emperor doesn't have any clothes. And we did it for 20 years, Murph, 20 years. As you know, you were over there. In fact, you went back to the same place that is the novel and where Vic was, right?
I was up north. I was in Parwan.
Oh, you had a good place. Yeah, right.
The cold place. So we kind of touched on this next question in the beginning, but we could go into more detail. So Helmand is not a place where America's interests are taken seriously, and Cruz, who prides himself in doing his duty, has no sense of the mission. You've stated that if a senior officer had ever asked his opinion about why they, the Marines, were there in Helmand, he, Cruz, would said he had no idea. No farmer's heart would be won, and no farmer's son would fight for the government in Kabul, somewhere on the other side of the moon. Can you elaborate a little more on that and the kind of what's going on in the storyline?
I think it kind of, I hope, speaks for itself. I don't want to put Vic is a major in the United States Marine Corps today, so I'm not going to turn this one over to him because that wouldn't be fair. But you're out there. You don't speak Dari. You don't speak Pashtun. You're supposed to be winning the hearts and minds of people who are cultivating their poppy and see you as the enemy because all they want to do is get their poppy out of town and make a good living. And what are we supposed to be doing? And I tried to set that up in the novel so that the reader was seeing it from the other side versus our side and beginning to say, uh-oh, there's a showdown coming here. There was an inevitability to the showdown. Just like there was an inevitability every time Vic went out with his platoon, every day, that someone was going to try to kill him.
And then again, we kind of hit on these touch points at the beginning, but I think it's still a good question here is, you elaborate a little more on the Afghani army and why there was so much distrust? There are many themes of greed, extortion, duplicity within the various factions, Taliban, farmers, the ANA, and then of course the Pakistanis. Was it all motivated by the poppy trade, as you said? It would appear that all the Americans out there, were not wanted there because they were just getting in the way of the Taliban's business, which was the poppy.
I believe human nature really doesn't change. And I was genuinely flabbergasted when I had more than one four-star general when they would take over. And I had known them for years. And they'd say, Bing, I know my predecessor really had problems with President Karzai, but I'm making this a clean slate. I'm going to start over again with him. And I'm going to look him in the eye and I'm going to tell him, this is it. These are the red lines. And I wanted to be kind, but I thought that was nuts. I mean, Karzai, when he was 50 years of age, his character had already been settled the way our characters have been settled by the time we're 25. Karzai was a thief. Karzai was manipulative. Karzai was selfish. He wasn't a real leader. And so the whole notion that we could go into another country and because we were nice or something, our four stars always felt that they could talk to another general. What a lot of crap. The character of these people hadn't changed. They'd look you in the eye, and the minute you walked out the door, they would continue to steal. That's what they were. They were thieves. So we were trying to build something on sand. And I try to indicate in the book time and time again why you couldn't trust them. You couldn't trust them because they were human beings. Because at 40 or 50 years of age, that's what they were going to do. So the poor Afghan lieutenant who's out there with Cruz, you know, I have that scene where he wants some of that poppy for his people, but the colonel's getting his cut. Well, that was true. I mean, that was what was going on. So I try to put it all out there.
So again, so the country, Afghanistan has repelled outsiders for thousands of years. You know, the British, Alexander, the Russians. As one of your characters tells Cruz, democracy was never the future for these tribes. We're antibodies in this culture. You were sent on a fool's mission. And then you say, as stated, how can generals and smart civilians and 3 presidents pursue nation building in these conditions described in the novel?
Yes, but let's not get, I mean, it's hard. I wrote a novel about people, about character development, about what it's like to be in battle, about what a platoon commander like Vic Garcia had to do and struggle with to keep the loyalty and to keep the squads doing what they were doing, to try to get along with his colonel, all the things that's human nature rather than geopolitics. If you see what I mean, Murph, the geopolitics are in the book, but the book isn't about the geopolitics. The book is about human beings. But when you read about the human beings, then you do begin to question the geopolitics.
So I think this is a good next question for the audience that I'm sure they're itching to know. So if combat is really this brutal, who will fight for us next time?
Whoa, ho, ho, ho. Oh boy. Oh boy. I think as a nation, we have to be very careful. The military is not a social petri dish. My good friend, General Jim Mattis, he and I wrote a book together. And when he was Secretary of Defense, he said, the lodestone that I want any official to grasp before he makes a decision is, does it increase the lethality of our force? Now think of what I just said. Lethality means you go out and kill the other person. That's what it means. The Marine Corps has been described as the most lethal force on the face of the earth. When you give somebody a rifle, he's not out there to make friends with a rifle. He's out there to dominate. And if we gradually lose sight that we need people like Vic Garcia, that we need genuinely tough guys who, when they're given a mission, say, now, sir, let me see if I understand you. You said, I'm to go out there and I'm to what? I'm to kill the enemy and come back victorious. Who will fight for us the next time? In 3 wars, Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, we've given the Vic Garcias of the world a messy mission. What do we tell them to do? Go out and make friends? I mean, what were they supposed to be doing? And then when the going got tough, all 3 times, the Congress of the United States and the president said, I quit. Well, okay, who's going to fight for us the next time? Now I'm seeing a lot of talk about that the military is racist. And I'm thinking, where'd all this racist stuff come from? We're out in the battlefield. I didn't know about this. So but a lot of people are talking about Black Lives Matter and we have to be more sensitive, et cetera. Well, stop. You got to be real careful because you want a cohesive military that is not diverse. We're not diverse, by the way. 75% of America cannot join the military because they're not qualified. So the idea that we're going to reflect the America isn't true. We want something better than America. to fight for America. So I think who will fight for us the next time, we have to be careful that we keep saying what General Mattis said. The criterion for the Department of Defense is to increase lethality, not social equity or something else.
So that was it for our questions. I figured, is there any last thing that you want to say, Bing, before we open it up to the audience?
No, I'd like to, did we cover things? I don't want to put Vic on the spot, but I would like to ask Vic, some of Vic's observations that he feels he can say. Vic?
Yes, Bing. I think on the microcosm that is the Marine Corps, in my experience, yes, we are the best America has in regards to the people that are willing to stand up and raise their hand and pledge their life for our nation. So yes, it is a very small percentage of our nation that is willing to do this. So having been a drill instructor, having obviously been a recruit, having been a officer candidate instructor, and a student at officer candidate school, there's always been the same individuals, the same type of patriot that's willing to stand up and continue to fight for America. So I think currently we're still fitting that bill with the right people able to stand up and do what needs to be done.
Back to you, Murph.
Perfect. So it looks like we have a couple of questions. So I'll just, as to the audience, if you want to type away in the chat box, but I'll ask the first one. If defeat sorry, I got to bring them closer. If you're saying we're going to be defeated there, is there any point in leaving troops there and spending substantial more funds and supporting a military presence?
I believe firmly yes. And I'll tell you for several reasons, but first, we have not had one American killed in Afghanistan in the last 18 months, not one. You are much more dangerous being a police officer anywhere in the United States than you are in Afghanistan. So we are, with our air and with our intelligence, because we have quite a network out there now of spies, we're able to keep power applied to people who genuinely want to kill us. And the cost in human lives isn't there for us. The monetary cost is about, say, $100 billion a year. I don't want to make light of it, but when we're now talking about trillions of dollars, and we don't even know where the trillions of dollars are going to go, this isn't a lot of money. So to keep the genuine terrorists from taking over and gradually developing again is a bargain if we stay there. Therefore, I don't want us to leave, but we are. The president has made up his mind, but I think it was a bad decision. And the other part of it is many Afghans aligned with us. And I had a few of them at my house this weekend with a sergeant major from the Ranger Battalion. And the Afghan interpreter who's now here, he told me that his sister had been shot in the stomach last week. They communicate about once a week by internet. And his brother-in-law and his cousin, who was 7, were executed because he said, now the word has gone out. If you work with the Americans, you're targeted. Wow, where does that stop? I saw that after we left Vietnam, and many innocent people are going to die, and there's no reason for it. Therefore, I believe we should have stayed the way we're now staying. No one even knew we were there, but we decided not to, and we're going to leave, but I think it's a bad mistake.
Is there any other questions from the audience?
Yeah, I'm not seeing anything else at the moment. I do certainly encourage anyone that has any questions, please just feel free to throw them down in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen.
I have a question, being while we wait for everybody else to join. So just quick backstory for everyone online, there's been a lot of restructuring. We're of course now focusing on more near peer threats as in Russia, Iran, China. In your opinion, kind of how do you see that affecting, say we were to stay in Afghanistan, how that's kind of affecting our focus on the mission there? And you alluded to with how technology, which we've seen firsthand when I was over there last, there was too much internet that you could talk home, go on patrol, and then come home and tell the whole family over there. So how do you see kind of the future wars evolving, and how a future Marine or soldier really is going to be completely different than what Vic and I have seen in our experience, and you've seen with the technology and how much more advanced it's becoming?
I'll limit that to only one thing because it's so broad, Murph. But I'll limit it to what I said earlier about communications. I now see that my beloved Marine Corps and all the services are saying we're going into a digital age, blah, 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 blah. I think that's exactly wrong. I think that the great danger we have is a competitor, especially China, that has the capacity to cut off these communications. And we know it. So telling everyone, we're going to be linked in, blah, 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 the United States Marine Corps is going to go island hopping in the South China Sea to prevent Chinese ships from coming out because we're going to use missiles against them. All of that assumes that we have this great connectivity. What if it all goes away? And I think it will. So that leads me to the one thing about the next major kind of war that I think is going to test America. It's not the Marine Corps. It's not our people in uniform. What I believe is going to happen is that China or somebody else is going to test our society. Consider 1940. Germany bombed England, and they ultimately killed over 40,000 English, of course, in a year. They were trying to bomb England to say, you have to reach terms with us. I don't think that's going to happen in the next war with bombs hitting the United States. You know what I think is going to happen? They're going to turn off the electricity. Now, they won't be able to do it all the time everywhere, but it'll cause all of us to have to go without our MasterCards, without being able just to shop anytime we want, without having enough dollars back in circulation, without having a stock market, and many times not having heat in the house, not having a refrigerator that's on all the time, just like in 1940 in England. They didn't have refrigerators. They were using ice. They didn't have lights on. They were using kerosene. But the spirit of the country stayed together. I think that the real challenge isn't going to be to our military. It's going to be, supposing the Chinese say, well, look, you and I have a dispute about Taiwan or something, and okay, we've lost a couple of ships on both sides, and I've had to turn out the lights in New York City now for 6 months, and you've turned out my lights in Shanghai, but I can go without my lights, and I really don't think you can, so can't we make an agreement? So I think the connectivity of the digital age affecting the domestic population is the most critical variable that I see changing in the next big war.
And it looks like we got another question in. Why is it so difficult as we hear to get the interpreters who cooperated with the troops, the Americans, out of the country?
I'll tell you what I think is the difficulty and why I think it's wrong. The difficulty is that the people in the White House who caused this by saying we're all pulling out are afraid if they now help those 20 to 40,000 Afghans who are on our side and begin to say, come on, we're going to get you out of here, that they're going to cause Saigon in 1975. See, they see that the minute they say things are going to change and everyone starts getting on the planes, there'll be panic. And therefore, President Biden won't look good. So they're basically saying, shh, we'll just leave them there. And there won't be any reporters there when it gradually falls. Now, I think that's exactly wrong and immoral. What we could do, because we have their names, we know who these people are. They've all applied. 18,000 have already applied to leave for years. We could send the word out to them and begin to fly them all out to Guam. And is the White House right in thinking that this is going to cause more panic? Yes. But is there going to be more panic anyway? Yes. So I believe the White House is trying to not be there when the panic happens. But I'd help those who had helped us.
Looks like I got another question. So what's your opinion of, the all draft army or that we had in Vietnam versus now all volunteer fighting force? And do you believe in some sort of national service for everyone, whether it's the draft, the army, or something else?
No. We have so spoiled the youth of America, all of them, that the idea of trying to say to the youth of America today, can you imagine going to the riots in Portland or anywhere and saying, hey guys, you all have to serve a year? I mean, they would just give you the finger and walk away. I mean, you couldn't get them to come if you wanted to. And if they did, they'd be so sullen, they would be so cynical, they would be so selfish. Not a chance. What we have is 1% of the youth of America volunteers for the military. 1%. And the 99%, wow, if you tried to tell them they had to do something and someone was going to try to enforce it, it'd be impossible.
It looks like that's it for questions. I think we have about 5 minutes left. Oh, another one just came in. General Milley appears to have embraced the critical race theory in his congressional statement last week. What is your view of the impact on morale of the troops with this? We were talking about this.
Come on. I'm an old guy. I mean, I'm going to say one thing before we sign off. This is the best book I ever wrote, The Last Platoon, because it's an adventure story. It's a mystery, but it gets into all this stuff, but on a human level. So I'm pushing my book. Okay, The Last Platoon, go out and read it. Now, about General Milley and this whole thing, holy smokes. General Milley should just keep his mouth shut. I mean, to wade into those kinds of social, political things when you're the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, that was nuts. He should get into a foxhole and stay there. The last thing, and the chief of naval operations, all these people suddenly saying, these high-level guys saying, we're all racists in the services. Where did all this come from? And how? I'll tell you. I mean, I can't ask a question of Vic Garcia. I'm just going to tell you how much I admire him, but this is not what the military should be doing. We're not a social petri dish, and stop it. Stop it. But before we leave, Murph, I have to tell you that, I've seen an awful lot of good combat leaders. But the reason when I wrote The Last Platoon that I modeled crews on Vic Garcia is because Vic Garcia was one of the shrewdest as well as bravest combat leaders that I've ever seen in 3 wars. And I say shrewd as well as brave because he knew what he was doing. He wasn't just rushing things, and he was calculating. He knew how to use one squad leader, how to use another, how to try to get along with someone. So as long as we have people like Vic, I'm confident we can do well on the battlefield. I'm not as confident that the entire American public can do as well as our troops will do on the battlefield.
Perfect. Well, I can't thank you enough, Bing, for this past hour. And Vic and I owe you probably a 6-pack now for getting thrown in this, but you should be used to it. So again, thank you for all the questions, and really appreciate both of your participation, and Semper Fi.
Semper Fi. Thank you. Thank you, Murph. Thanks, Vic.
Thanks, Bing. Murph.